I'm Peter Rankin, and I'm here mainly, I think, because I ran the New Zealand Planning Council for about 8 years. I was there for 10. And the Planning Council was one of the more interesting government attempts to enrich the public policy debate. Its legislative mandate was to monitor and report on the medium and long-term issues facing the social, economic, cultural and environmental development of New Zealand. I got to it from a somewhat odd background, I suppose, because my degree is in Greek and Latin, and then I worked for Foreign Affairs for about 13 years in Delhi, Ottawa, on trade work and geographical policy work, and then in Brussels doing trade work there just as Britain was entering the common market. So that was a fairly hectic sort of time, and one that made me think, hey, we really do have to change things. Interestingly, I shared a room there with Roger Kerr, and he and I both came to that conclusion that, hey, we've got to go back to New Zealand and change things. We had slightly different visions of how to change things, but we kept in touch. And then I went off to Harvard and did a Master in Public Policy, Public Administration, at the Kennedy School of Government, which was wonderful. Went from there to a consulting contract with the US Department of Agriculture, and then to Georgetown University and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. And it was from there that Frank Holmes asked me to come back to the Planning Council. So it was quite a varied sort of background, and quite a good one in the sense that I didn't bring to the job a narrow expertise. And that turned out to be very good, because the Planning Council wasn't about narrow expertise, it was about a broad vision of where the whole place is going. And it's quite hard to get there. We did a number of things to find ways of trying to achieve that. One that I think worked best was we set up a whole lot of separate monitoring groups. There had been an economic monitoring group, and from the early days of the Planning Council there'd been a Māori round table which had brought Māori leaders in. And we said, hey, maybe that's the seed of a more structured way of getting this broader vision. So we set up a social monitoring group, and a population monitoring group, and an employment monitoring group, and an income distribution monitoring group. We tried to set up an environmental monitoring group and never succeeded. It was too difficult in those days to get a set of aspects of the environment that you could monitor and get something useful out of. But each of those groups had a council member who was particularly involved, a secretariat member or two who were particularly involved, and a network out into the community of academic people, policy people, government people from departments, or just community people, business people who were interested in that area. And so that gave us quite a broad network of interest and expertise around each of those. And then the council itself, of course, was constantly being bombarded by these reports from the different aspects and made to think in a broader way about where the place is going. And I think it worked really quite well. Right from the beginning of the Planning Council, there was a strong effort to bring in Māori people, Māori organisations, iwi, hapu. The original task force that recommended setting up the Planning Council involved some Māori leaders, because Frank Holmes and Ken Piddington, who were the two key actors, thought that that was really essential to the identity of New Zealand. And Ken had a particular background in it, because his father was a very famous professor of anthropology who'd done a lot of work on Māori and Pacifico and knew his stuff well, and so Ken did too. And so they started out with, as I mentioned before, the Māori Round Table. And Frank would bring that group together and ask them to raise issues of interest to them. Tilly Reedy had superb contacts, not just with her own Ngāti Porou, but with a range of iwi and hapu around the country. And she was fascinated with what we were doing at the Planning Council and said, iwi and hapu need this information. They need to know about the future of employment, the future of industries that they might get involved in. So she organised hui a iwi all over the place. We went up to Ngāti Porou, to Kahununu, to Wharetoa, to Ngāti Whātua, and Tilly would organise a meeting on ground which, not usually in a marae itself, usually on an independent piece of ground where the two organisations could actually meet and talk. And she went to a lot of trouble to train the Secretariat in particular in Te Reo, in being able to understand Māori concepts and Māori ways of looking at things. And we did that right through for 6 years. And it was a most amazingly educative experience for us. And I think Māori got a lot out of it too. And departments, other government departments, saw what we were doing. And this was just when the Treaty of Waitangi, the Waitangi Tribunal was really getting going. And departments needed to learn how to deal with Māori. And this gave them a way of starting. And I think it had quite an impact. Well, I think we did play quite a role in getting government in general, and in the broadest sense, to focus on longer term issues. It mightn't sound like it. I mean, we're always complaining about government not having a longer term vision, and business in particular not having a longer term vision. But boy, it's a lot better than it used to be. Nowadays you do have, as you're aware, the Treasury long-term fiscal outlooks. Local authorities have to produce long-term community plans. That was all inconceivable in the 70s. So we have made some progress in that, and I think the Planning Council helped with that. We do have to think about how New Zealand is going to make its way in the world in the longer term. And there's a raft of big issues around that. There's the whole thing of identity within a globalizing world. How are we going to deal with that? We talk about economic development as though it's just about extracting more resources from the ground or from the farm or from the trees or something like that. But that's not the way the global economy works these days. And there is going to be a limit on each of those, and we don't have the capital to develop them ourselves, so the capital is going to come from somewhere else, and therefore the reward to capital is going to go somewhere else. So we're not going to get the full benefit out of that approach. So what is it that we've got to do to make New Zealand survive? And the resource that is most obvious is the people. We've got to develop our people. We've got to enable them to fulfill their potential. And that's true whether they were born here or whether we attract them in. It's not a matter of training more scientists or training more business people. It's a matter of enabling the potential in each of those to find its way out. That's a really difficult question because, as I was saying before, you need a structure that will allow you to take a broad view, to be independent, You need a funding source, therefore, that gives you the confidence that you can look at things in a broad way, and that gives you confidence to say things that people don't want to hear. But there is no structure that will give you that. There is no funding source that will give you that. It's got to be something that you work at and develop. I think if I was doing it again, you'd have to involve the government at quite an early stage in it. But maybe you should try and bring other organisations together and try and get a group together that's government, private sector, civil society, and get them to work together on something like New Zealand at the Turning Point, and say, okay, out of that, can we develop something that you all put in a block of money that gives it an investment fund so that it's got some reliable continuing source of income that can't easily be chopped. And there will always be a way of killing it off, but that would give you at least something to start with that might give you a good chance. But then you've got to really look for the people who are not going to play, who are interested in policy, not politics. And it can be hard to find those people.